Okay, everybody, welcome to WorkReduce Live. We've got our participants rolling in for our third edition of WorkReduce Live. I'm Brian Dolan. I'm the CEO and founder of WorkReduce. And today we're going to be talking about the problem of ad fraud. We've got a great set of panelists here, and I'll be introducing all of them in a second as soon as we get some additional participants. People are still rolling in. So again, I'm Brian Dolan, CEO and founder of WorkReduce, and we are conducting this webinar series to educate our friends and colleagues in the industry about a range of issues that confront people who are buying and selling ads. So far, we've done topics that have included the future of training, the future of media planning tools, and I hope you'll join us next week for a fireside chat with Rashad Tabakawala, who's the former CEO of Publicis. We'll be talking about his book about bringing purpose into business. And then the following week, we'll have a panel of ad tech journalism journalists, and we'll be turning the tables on the people who cover all of us and ask them what it's like to cover this kind of really, interesting and multifaceted industry. So with that, let's get to our topic for the day, which is ad fraud. I am super delighted to present this exciting panel to you guys. We've got people representing a range of different companies and perspectives and market segments who are affected by this very serious and challenging problem, that I think we've all heard a lot about. We're going to dig into what really is ad fraud, where does it come from, who does it affect, and what can advertisers or even consumers do about it. So I'll go through and introduce our panelists here, and then we'll dive into some of the questions. So on my screen, in the upper left, I've got Dr. Augustine Fou. Dr. Fou is a researcher who has spent over 25 years, in data science and has turned his sights on the data behind ad fraud, working with a lot of large consumer brands. We've got also LD, or Louis David Mangin, the CEO and founder of Confiant, which is a technology company that focuses on protecting consumers from the malicious advertising and malware that is coming through the advertising ecosystem. Next, we have Joshua Lowcock. Joshua is the Chief Digital Officer and Global Brand Safety Head of Universal McCann, which is a full-service media agency, or are you guys media buying only? I don't remember.
Media agency.
Media agency that is very large and well-respected. We've got Claire Atkin. Claire writes for Branded. Branded is a Substack newsletter which covers issues relating to disinformation and ad fraud and brands, and is also a B2B marketer. And last, we've got Roy Rosenfeld, who is the SVP of product for DoubleVerify, a technology company that works across the advertising ecosystem, ranging from advertisers and running live, ad tag protection through into the exchanges. And then, do you guys work with publishers too, Roy, or just the buy side? And with publishers. So, from this crew, we're going to get a pretty broad spectrum. I've introduced them so you don't have to hear their sales pitches, but we'll let them maybe weave that in there a little bit as well. So why are we talking about ad fraud? WorkReduce, we're a company that provides staff augmentation and service desk support to media buyers. Why do we care about ad fraud? Well, interesting story. About 2 years ago, one of my customers came to me and said, hey, they're a buyer and a seller, right? One of these kind of multifaceted companies. And they said, we're having a problem with mobile ad redirects. Our users are browsing our site and they're being forced onto these other pages, and it's driving us and them crazy. And the technical solutions that we're looking for, that we're using, aren't delivering. Can you have people from WorkReduce monitor our websites and track these down. So we did, right? We used a technical solution to be able to track, where the fraud originated, and allowed this publisher to then go back and say, hey, Exchange X, you need to turn off these publishers. And in the process, I started looking at the code, which fascinated me. I used to be a software engineer. We started tracing it back, and we were able to look at the technical attacks, and then eventually traced it back to an individual who was perpetrating this stuff, a guy who looked like he was running a normal agency, but through some technical and social engineering, we were able to figure out who it was, and I was hooked. So I've stayed really close to this topic as much as I can over the past few years. And that's why I wanted to bring these folks together. So let's start off and just talk about, what is the impact of ad fraud, from an economic perspective on the market. Roy, let me turn it over to you and just give us your sense, from DoubleVerify's perspective. What does ad fraud mean to the ad industry?
First, thank you for having us on, and thank you for everyone who joined. When we think about ad fraud, we think holistically about anything that puts the ad dollars that brands are putting into work at risk, and as a result of that, they often risk the publishers and the users as well. And when we think about the impact of ad fraud, what we usually see is that fraud, on one end, it proliferates throughout the entire space. So wherever you have media supported by ad dollars, you will find fraudsters trying to get their chunk of the pie. And with media spend focusing on different areas, back in the day it was in the web, then on mobile, today it's shifting into CTV, you often see the bad guys, the fraudsters, going after that and looking for vulnerabilities and the different loopholes that they can take advantage of to do what they do best. And I think that if you try to quantify the impact, it really depends on the different strategies that the brands and buyers and platforms employ. If you know who you're buying from, if you understand what you're targeting, if you understand the risks and you employ protection, the economic impact and the impact of fraud will be lower. If you're more naive and you're just targeting the I would say the lower cost inventory, and you're not sure who you're buying from, and you don't have a good relationship in place, and you're not using any filtering or any tools to protect yourself, then the impact of fraud will potentially be higher.
Okay. Carrie, put any numbers to that? Because I know if I turn this to Dr. Fou, he'll have some ideas there.
We usually talk about, again, about the different use cases, and it really depends how people buy. We've seen this ranging from super low rates for buyers who are sophisticated, who know to use tools, who groom their site lists, who work with partners, both direct premium news publishers and through highly scalable DSPs and programmatic buys. If they're using the right tools and they're proactive about it, rates will be very, very low. On the other hand, if you're looking for the cheapest CTV inventory and you're not employing any controls whatsoever, it can skyrocket. And I'll let Dr. Fou, he probably has some numbers about that too.
All right, so over to you, Augustine. I think you're very vocal about this on Twitter. Isn't the cost just baked in to the price advertisers are paying if they're doing some of the things that Roy is saying?
Yeah, that's a very frequent argument that I hear. So, fraud is priced in, so we're happy to keep buying it because historically, just using an example, we used to pay $30 CPMs to big publishers, but now we get the ads for $3. It's like 1/10 the cost. But what they're not realizing is that they're buying 10 times the quantity. So they're still spending $30. They're not saving any money per se. But because they're buying $3 inventory versus $30 from good publishers, then their exposure to fraud is much higher. And when you talk about numbers, I don't usually cite like an industry-wide number because, for having done this for many, many years, no matter how big the number, the larger the number, it sounds impressive or whatever, but it doesn't cause any marketers to take action because the result is they just think it doesn't apply to them. It's someone else's problem. So they often just don't take action. But other numbers I use, I cite a range. And just like Roy was saying, it could be very low or very high. So I usually cite a range of 1 to 100%. So there's campaigns where it's 100% fraud, and it's very clear. And that's just because of the way they buy.
It's a good range. You're covering all the bases there.
That's a good range. And you'll notice that 0% is not in that range, because any campaign that's reporting zero fraud, something's wrong with the measurement. So bottom line is, like Roy was saying, if you have very good buying hygiene or practices, and you use technology, so you're actually looking at the data yourself, there are campaigns that are run very, very cleanly.
So you're saying the fraud-free guarantees that some vendors are offering in the space might not be 100% accurate?
It's based on what they can see. So they're of course free to offer that, but marketers should realize that they can only guarantee what they can see. So the reason I don't cite industry-wide numbers is I'm sure that I and others are missing some forms of fraud. We just didn't know what they are and what to look for. So, like you see year after year, we see these very large botnets or fraud schemes being exposed. There's gonna be more, right? It's just that we haven't discovered them right now. So it's very hard to make an accurate industry-wide fraud number, because you don't know what you don't know. It's a lot easier to look at your own campaigns and make sure you have the right processes and practices in place so that your campaigns are not affected. So then the industry-wide numbers actually become irrelevant.
So let's turn this to what actually happens with the ad fraud and who's impacted from the consumer side. Claire, what would you say is the impact of ad fraud to an end user or end consumer, and what are some of the issues that you're seeing and concerned about?
I see two big ones. The first is that, of course, when marketing starts to get more and more expensive, the pricing of goods and services also gets expensive. So consumers don't win because of ad fraud. But on the much more poignant and I would say topical concern, ad fraud is also impacting the news industry. And it's impacting the news industry because we're trying to fix it using tools that are also hurting the news, tools like keyword block lists. So keyword block lists work by blocking certain words or certain key terms that marketers might consider dangerous or uncomfortable, and that's not what they should be doing. It works when you are trying to target individual topics that might be uncomfortable for your brand. But what is happening is that these terms are going on this list, and these lists are getting longer and longer. And what they're actually ending up doing is blocking the news, which is really bad for marketers.
So what I think I'm hearing you say is that the question of ad fraud and the question of brand safety are pretty closely intertwined. Is that a fair assessment?
They're absolutely interconnected. And we don't even deal with with ad fraud at Branded. We're mostly concerned with brand safety. Are your ads on hate sites? Are they on disinformation sites? And we're looking at these site lists, and we're seeing ad fraud when we go and look for these other things.
Got it. And so
that makes a really good point about the difference between a whitelist and a blacklist. It's one thing to use a set of terms to target something. It's another thing, a set of use of terms to reverse exclude it rather than target it. And just because something works well as a whitelist mechanism does not mean that you can just flip it and use it as a blacklist mechanism.
So LD, picking up on that, what are you doing to help the publishers, protect consumers? Are you helping them confront this blacklist whitelist problem? Is it strictly technical? Like, what do you see from the pub side?
Sure. So what Roy and Augustine were talking about was the vector where the advertiser is the victim. It's where the impression is fraudulent in some way. There are two vectors though that exist in there are two vectors though that exist in the ad world from which the industry is being compromised. The second one is when the user is the victim. And that's similar to it's the type of attacks that you were mentioning at the beginning of the call in terms of mobile redirects, exploit kits, drive-by downloads, scams. Right now, there's been a huge growth of cryptocurrency scams in Europe. Thankfully, the US hasn't been hit that much, and that's probably due to the regulatory bodies here, that the FBI and the SEC are much stronger about controlling cryptocurrencies. But Europe, as well as the broader world, it's rife with these scams, and people are losing their life savings. The malvertisers, which are what Confiant seeks to protect, and so protecting the user from these scams, from these attacks, the onus for that, it's kind of a catch-22. The publishers are the ones that feel the most pain, but they're at the end of the chain of events that has led to that attack happening. The attack occurs because somewhere upstream, someone allowed a bad advertiser to buy a campaign and enter and access the programmatic industry and to send these attacks through it. It's the unfortunate reality that in both vectors, there's a lot of competing incentives, and the reality is that the bad guys pay. In our case, malvertising, they're a DSP and SSP. That's a campaign that gets paid for. Even the publisher gets paid. Now, obviously, they don't want that; they want to block it. Similarly, on the fraudulent impression vector, there's a lot of competing incentives as well. At the end of the day, the publishers are the ones, similar to what Claire is saying, that are bearing the brunt of this, because they're the ones for whom the dollar doesn't go into their pocket. Whatever is that percentage of inventory that is actually deemed fraudulent, the advertiser's dollar, that percentage, well, all the middle layers still get their cut. It's the publisher who economically bears the cost, because that dollar doesn't get spent with them in a legitimate way.
So, and Joshua, before I turn to you, I just want to point out that we have a Q&A enabled here. We're starting to get some really good questions coming through that we'll address. But before we get to them, LD, you brought up the question of incentives. And I know, Joshua, that's something that you've thought quite a bit about. What are the incentives to mitigate fraud? And where does the role of the agency stand in that chain of incentives?
Okay, so I guess there's a multi-part question there, because agencies, we represent our clients, and our clients do not want to pay for fraud. And so contractually with publishers, as LD sort of alluded to, we pass the cost of fraud onto the publisher or the ad tech partner. So when fraud occurs, there's no risk exposure to the client in an abstract sense, except as, Claire and Augustine outlined, the cost of CPMs does get adjusted to account for that wastage for fraud. I think the bigger issue and concern for agencies and clients is it outsources the risk and responsibility. So no client pays for fraud. It doesn't necessarily ensure that the ecosystem is held accountable for bad inventory and for sites in there that shouldn't be monetized. So to Claire's point, fraudulent inventory can take the form of, like, these are sites that shouldn't be having ads on them, that have ads on them. They're either, in Augustine's experience, trafficked by bots that are just generating millions of wasted impressions. That's a concern to agencies, and we're looking to, obviously stamp that out. The bigger one, where collectively as an industry where we need to act, is where those sites are perpetuating the fraud and getting into the ecosystem. We're also pushing false news and false narratives and causing harm to society. And that's a bigger risk to me than just the drive-by downloads and cryptocurrency mining, because that starts to defund legitimate operations and undermines entire faith in the advertising ecosystem.
Right, definitely. And just, I think you made a good point in the panelist chat, Joshua, that I think is worth bringing back up, that the industry is moving to the term inclusion and exclusion lists as opposed to black and white lists.
So we don't use the term,
very timely right now.
Yeah, so we don't use black or white lists. It's absolutely inclusion or exclusion lists. The only other thing I'd like to bring up is there's, third-party verification is great, but you absolutely need to check your ads. And if I like Augustine's comment that you don't know how much fraud there is. It could be between 1% and 100%. I would hope to God that it's not 100%. Advertising should drive a business outcome. If you're justify advertising based on business outcomes, then checking your ads and understanding, you know, what's actually valid is easy to demonstrate. And I think Claire's done some analysis in that area.
Checking your ads is not so hard, but what you have to remember is that bots and algorithms and all of the technology that we think is keeping our brand safe from places that peddle disinformation or hate speech, those are not enough. We have to use humans to check the ads. We just did a case study with headphones.com. Headphones.com is a direct-to-consumer
Great
headphone
site.
seller. They're from Canada. We love them. And they were using Criteo to retarget their visitors to their page. And with retargeting, you would think that you're only paying for the click. Well, we looked at the ads and we found about 20 hate and disinformation sites within that inventory, which is already bad. But then on top of that, we found a ton of places where those ads had no business being. From a marketer's perspective, their target market are not on Android games. They're not in parts of the world where they don't even ship to. And
right, to buy a $200 pair of headphones.
Yeah, or even up to like 1,000 or 2,000. Like
right.
these are really nice pieces of art, and so it just didn't make sense that they were there. And what they did after we talked to them is they blocked all of the Android platform at all, because they couldn't do it piecemeal because Criteo doesn't allow for that. They blocked outside of US and Canada, and they blocked all of the hate sites that we identified. And when they did that, they found that they saved 95% of their ad spend. It went from $1,200 per day to $40 per day. So over $30,000 a month for this, like, not enormous direct-to-consumer company is very significant.
Yeah. So we're getting a bunch of questions coming in here. Let me just put one to you, Claire, while you're on here. From Michael, he says, "What if my ads are on a premium site, but the author of the article is spreading aggressive opinions not in line with my company's values?" I think that's the crux of the question for a lot of advertisers. How do we figure that out?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, the news is not perfect. The news should have journalistic standards, but what has happened is that there has been an increase in the amount of opinion pieces within newspapers. And so this recent Tom Cotton piece in the New York Times is a perfect example.
Yep.
Do we want to be on this? He was inciting violence from the state, and normally the New York Times doesn't do that, and it was a bit of a surprise. I think in that case, you can hold the newspapers to account for this kind. You can say, as an advertiser, I would not like this content to be next to my ads. They used to have newspapers before programmatic. They used to have editors who would be ad editors who would make sure that there wouldn't be any awkward placements.
Adjacency is not a new problem and not unique to digital. We can say that for sure.
Sure, yeah. That's just, I mean, we have a big mess. The newspapers and the news organizations also have to clean up their side of it. But in the meantime, we cannot stop funding them.
Got it.
Let me add a little color to what Claire was saying earlier in terms of her case study. There are bots that deliberately cause retargeting, so they actually earn more money when they get retargeted. So in a parallel case, the bots would go to a lot of medical journal websites and pharma websites. And when they get retargeted, they earn a higher CPM. So then they actually deliberately go to different sites. Those are called cash out sites. And when the ad loads there, those sites make the money. So in the case of the headphones.com, when they go to these fake news sites, that's how they help these sites make more money, because the advertiser thinks they're retargeting a user that visited their site previously, but it's now causing an ad to load on these other sites and they're cashing out. So part of what the business owner did was, when they clamped down on the out of geo ad impressions, and also they blacklisted these disinformation sites, they also blocked a lot of those bots from causing retargeting ads. So, it saved them a lot of money. That's net output. And they didn't see any negative impact on their business outcomes. So they got to win there.
Got it. So let's, like, where does some of this stuff come from? We have a question from Rob saying, you know, basically more of a statement than a question, the lack of know your customer rules for the on-ramps to the programmatic ecosystem, right? So how are people getting this stuff into play? You know, Roy, do you want to take a crack at talking about what some of the vectors are here?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about hygiene a little bit earlier in terms of the buy side. You often see there are tiers in the ecosystem, but everything at the end of the day is interconnected. So it's usually enough for one actor to not keep supplier or website onboarding hygiene for that website to come in. And then the interconnections and the the way that inventory just flows through the system makes it available in many exchanges. And it often is an issue of, we talked earlier, you have to know who you're buying from. For sellers, for selling platforms, you have to know the publisher, right? And I think that the know your customer is a very good point on that end. Now, we can't necessarily force everyone to comply, but what we try to do is we try to practice that hygiene definitely with our partners. And there has also been multiple industry initiatives like Ads.txt, Sellers.json, and other initiatives, which were very helpful in exposing and adding transparency, which is a very critical component that in the past was lacking. So it doesn't necessarily eliminate the problem, but it makes it much easier for platforms that are sitting in the middle and facilitating the transactions to understand where inventory is coming from, who's selling it, and then assign trust tokens and the ability to understand, is this something that's trustworthy or not? So that level of
has it gotten better
really critical.
with ads.txt and sellers.json? Like, has that made an impact?
I would say absolutely. Absolutely. So first, it really helped with certain types of fraud. It really helped eliminated website falsification and app falsification. It's not that the fraudsters have gone away, right? As much as, you know, people like to talk about organized crime. For many of them, it's a job, almost a day job, right? They don't go on panels like this one. Maybe they have their own, but that's what they do. So when you block one vector of attack, right? Maybe some of them drop off, but some of them just move on into another vector of attack. So I think you can compare that a little bit to regular crime. It's a form of crime. It's potentially not going completely away, but it's our job to make it much harder to try and eliminate the incentive for fraudsters. And Ads.txt, that was a great initiative. We continue to see that, and we can't wait for the adoption on the CTV space to pick up. Sellers.json, and we were talking about how fraud publishers on board. We think that's a great tool to help fight that. And there are multiple other initiatives that's at play. And I think it's not just the fact that there are initiatives and whether they are successful at stopping any specific point of fraud. It's the fact that in the last few years, awareness increases many folds, and the cooperation between different industry bodies, the different platforms, the different vendors, that's also really helpful in avoiding fraud and other issues, and add transparency and trust. Like Joshua said, that's a key point of the online ad ecosystem. Without trust, there's less buying, less support of free internet, less support of news, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, my experience, right, in talking to the exchanges and SSPs is that it still remains really challenging for them to confirm who the buyers are, or even the sellers in some cases, and we can talk about that separately, because at the end of the day, there's so many access points to the ecosystem. People are able to call up a guy, you know, at the end of the quarter and buy an ad, right? And spend that money. And like, you know, you've got people who are incentivized to meet that end of quarter deadline, and they're going to send over some, you know, ad tags that maybe deploy malware. Like, you know, can ads.txt and sellers.json actually solve that problem, which is the true kind of know your buyer issue?
No,
No.
because it's
Yeah, I
a
mean,
text file. Because it's a text
yeah,
file.
there's always going to be mechanisms to go around this. At the end of the day, it's a question of at what level do we tackle this problem. Fundamentally,
Yes.
the industry has a ton of tech debt in terms of how it's built its infrastructure. It also has a lot of process debt. The reality is that 30 years ago, advertisers were not, agencies were not needing to play and have the types of processes that they need to do in a world today. We have, over the past 25 years, created a whole industry that has a whole new slew of issues because there was no, you couldn't catch a virus from an ad. You couldn't, and there was no way, either you had the New York Times or you didn't. There wasn't a fake newspaper. There wasn't, they weren't going to run the ad in a separate place. And so at which layer do we look at the problem is a critical component to it, because depending on how we approach that, we will look to bring solutions that may actually exacerbate other issues. The reality is that this is an industry where there's a lot of competing incentives. There's also a lot of conflicts of interest. So there are some elements of what needs to be done that, and I'll be a bit controversial, may not actually, shouldn't be profit driven. There are elements of technology that this industry needs to have run properly that should be a utility that everyone has and that the industry imposes upon everyone. At the end of the day, this is a very easy conversation because there are two sides. There's the bad guys, and then there's all of us. As long as we are not a malvertiser or a fraudster, we are not the bad guys. So us, the non-bad people, should be able to work together to build a structure and a standard that applies to all of the situations that we're in, and that doesn't place the burden just on the agencies, or doesn't place the burden on profit-driven companies that, again, if we're all motivated by profit, those incentives create conflicts, because you take a platform, hey, they need to add another, it's like they bring a new buyer to the table, and they've been working with DoubleVerify for years, they love them, they think their code is great, but this new buyer says, oh, no, we only like this other company. Well, now that's a whole other cost. And these costs just multiply and layer, and they create inefficiencies.
There's a blockchain joke in here somewhere that I'm trying to resist making.
Don't go there, Brian.
These are systemic issues. These are systemic. Careful. Blockchain is only as good as what you feed into it.
Yeah.
Blockchain is a process. If you feed bad stuff in, you get bad stuff out. And that's part of the problem here, is that you need to be able.
And LD, this is America, so you can't tell people not to have a profit motive. Everyone's going to be in it to make as much money as possible for themselves.
I'm going to be a bit more direct. I'm going to be
Joshua, go ahead.
LD's being polite, and profit motives are a euphemism for greed.
Yeah. And
it's greed that allows a lot of this to occur. And I'm looking at the questions coming up in chat. Like, there's a piece that Meg Graham did recently, and it's where she made a fake site. It's not sufficient. You don't have to be, and no offense to, Meg's work, you don't have to be sophisticated to perpetuate fraud. She demonstrated that was painfully easy. So the SSPs and exchanges are letting inventory on without basic levels of checking. And just going through, the question that came up from someone else in the chat, which was about, is it possible to check your ads, when you're advertising at scale? I think there's two parts to that, which is, there's this myth in digital media of scale of inventory. There's so many sites, there's fragmentation, therefore you need to be advertising everywhere. Well, we know that's not true because it opens the door to fraud. And it is possible to check where your ads run because you can pull your log files. And the amount of, I know Augustine does it, I know Claire does it, the amount of people that actually bother to sit down and check their log files and go, where did my impressions get delivered? What ones actually drove an outcome?
I have a small army of people who do this for our agency customers, right?
You can call
absolutely
Brian.
doable.
He'll help you. Yeah, Brian will
if anyone wants to get people at scale, I'm your guy. Like we can definitely help out there. But sorry, continue, Joshua.
And I guess the other thing that no one talks, like we've been talking about ad fraud and the advertising side and using third-party verification to stop your ad being served at bad people, or non-existent people, or bad sites, and all of the above. The other thing we don't talk about is the actual poisoning of your DMP and your CRM systems,
right?
With fraudulent traffic that you then start chasing around. And so it doesn't matter if you're blocking the ad if you've got a database of customers that are poisoned and don't really exist.
Yeah, or entirely fake. Just like, remember the Lotame example, they had to purge 400 million profiles because, oops, they found out they were all bots. So like I was saying earlier, the bots can pretend to be humans, either by the sites that they visit so that they create a profile that's desirable for a marketer to target, or they can actually click on things, do search terms and things like that. So bots are very clever. You know, we, the good guys, are always up against an enemy that has good tech and good skills, and there's a whole range of them. So kind of tying this back to what we said earlier, you know, beyond just the economic harm to publishers and to marketers, there's now societal harm that's coming out of systematic funding of hate sites and disinformation sites. So, you know, Claire and I were talking yesterday, you know, it's not just the one or two embarrassing ads that that show up on porn sites or whatever. It's because there's a large flow of dollars consistently going to these sites. And the people who are intent on spreading disinformation, they know there's a big pool of money here so that they can steal from. So whereas maybe 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, before programmatic was so widespread, it was much harder for an activist or a bad guy to spread misinformation because they'd actually have to pay for the servers themselves, right, and get people there. But now with the combination of social media and a way to fund their fake news, they now can make money so that they can keep doing it and doing more of it. Right?
A lot
So
of guys
kind of,
in bedrooms in the Ukraine making pretty good money.
Craig Silverman reported on that years ago, right? Macedonian teens could
Macedonia,
create
that's
fake
what I was
story,
thinking of.
right?
That's right. They're great at it.
And now they have a way to make money so they can actually grow and expand. They didn't have that ease before. So that's why fake news is spreading even faster now.
So getting tons of good questions coming through here. You know, please keep them coming. Claire, did you want to jump in again on the manual review issue before we close that one out?
Sure. There was a fun question in the chat that said, oh, it's impossible to check every ad. We're not checking every ad. We're checking the site list where the ads are going. And that's a really important difference because the understanding of brand safety that is so widespread within ad tech is that you don't want your brand next to controversial or maybe uncomfortable topics. That's ridiculous. We don't want our brands funding hate speech and disinformation. That is a huge difference. What we're looking at is a site-by-site analysis, not a page-by-page analysis.
And doing it by volume, presumably, as well.
Sure, but
right.
I don't care if my ad is on, as a marketer, I don't care if my ad is on a bad news page because the brand equity that I'm getting, that trust exchange that I'm getting between the publisher and my brand is still existent there.
Yeah.
Because it's important to remember that
there's something to be said of not, I'm sorry.
Sorry. It's important to remember that this is a two-way street. By having my brand as an advertiser on a publisher with good, high trust, public trust, consumer trust, I am associating my brand equity with their high brand equity. Conversely, publishers also benefit from being associated with high-value brands, high-value advertisers. And so when we are running our programmatic ads, we have to keep that fundamental relationship, that fundamental back and forth street into consideration. And if we don't, then we are putting our own brands at risk. So we're not talking about ads, each individual ad. We're talking about the site lists.
Yeah, and there was one question I think in here. Sorry, go ahead.
There's something very relevant to be said about not shying away from uncomfortable conversations as well. I think it's very, very temporally relevant at our day and time, and so it's representative of what you're talking about.
Yeah, we do something very parallel to what Claire is saying. So we look at the sites and the apps that are the most egregious offenders first, right? So just echoing Claire's point, if there's a long tail app that's eating up 10 of your impressions, that's immaterial. Whereas if you have a flashlight app or a domain that's eating up 10% of your impressions, then that has a huge impact. So the sooner you can actually find those fraudulent sites or the not brand safe sites or the disinformation sites and turn them off, the better your campaign is going to run.
So I see a theme kind of emerging in the chat. Thank you, Angelina, for bringing this one up around Google on one hand, and what is the role of Google and other suppliers in the ecosystem, and who's culpable there, but also about, and let's start with this, what happens as the cookie crumbles? We were talking about this a little bit before we started. As the cookie crumbles, what does that mean for fraud? Does it get worse? Does it get better? Does it change the availability of information, the level of transparency that we have on where ads are being delivered?
It's important to recognize that these issues are both systemic in that they pervade every layer of the ecosystem. There is no exclusive part, as Augustine said, there's no zero. This is systemic, but it's also systemic because it's endemic. We are working in a digital medium. As such, being digital means that we are, by the very nature of the environment that we work in, these issues will always perpetuate unless we all take an active role there. We can't say, oh, it's Google's responsibility, or it's the agency's responsibility, or hey, let's all pay DoubleVerify and they'll solve it for everyone. Everyone has a responsibility here, and that's the challenge, is getting everyone to align on standards, on next steps, on conversations like these, where we actually look at, hey, not what the state of the world is today, but what do we need to do so that in 5 years from now, we've actually skewed the landscape. The difference of the ad-supported world versus the broader internet is that the broader internet, the bigger it gets, the more holes get created. The more technology you bring, the more digital you bring, there will be edge cases, and these edge cases propagate. The ad-supported web, the ad part of it, these are pipes that are owned by us collectively, i.e. the publisher owns their site, the agency owns their servers, and in between everyone, all those pipes are connected. Now it's a mishmash, it's not properly structured, but from a security point of view, if the industry can just skew the landscape slightly in favor of the right types of standards, in favor of the right types of principles, and apply those ubiquitously, we can create an environment where we can keep people out. Because security is all about the feedback loop, whether it's DoubleVerify protecting from fraudulent impressions, or Confiant protecting from malicious ads. It isn't just about knowing the bad ad today or the bad impression today. It's about controlling the feedback loop of information from the system to us, and from the system to the bad person, so that tomorrow, when they do +1 to their mechanisms, we can stay ahead of that, and stay ahead of that, and stay ahead, and continuously do it. It is an ongoing thing. It's not a snapshot.
Does that have to originate from the browser versus an industry trade body? Let's open that one up to the floor.
So it can, I would say it can come from anyone. Again, it's a matter of employing the right business hygiene and technology hygiene. It's not one thing or the other, right? There are things that the browsers can do to protect against malicious ads and drive-by downloads and force redirects. There are things that companies, vendors, agencies, SSPs, DSPs can do in order to ensure that. I'll just give an example. We had many cases of bad folks, fraudsters in disguise, coming to us and wanting to work with us, or pretending to be an ad server so they can get whitelisted, right? Now, we have good hygiene, but you'll be surprised, the MRC, they had to put something called the business partner qualification section into their guidelines, because not everyone practices that, and there's a significant risk that bad guys can get access to the data, reverse engineer it, and have an easier time. So I think everything LD said is correct. Because of the incentives, we need those guidelines. Because of the incentives, we need to employ more technology. Because it works at internet scale, we need to combine checking things, looking at the data manually, along with things that scale at the DSP and internet level, and works at that kind of data sets and impression volumes. But it's the combination and the layering of the different solutions at the different levels by different companies, but it begins with the awareness and the intent, and understanding the incentives, and understanding how you can do better. And without that seed, it's much tougher.
I think a lot of the people on this webinar are, kind of get that at a high level. They might enjoy us digging into more specifics. So I do want to bring back what Brian said earlier, which is the third-party cookies going away in terms of the browsers doing away with that. What's everyone's take on whether that's going to lower fraud, increase fraud, or have no impact? I have my opinion, but I'll hold. But go ahead, Josh.
I think I'm going to probably align with you, which is I think it has the potential to increase fraud. And, you know, while the cookie is immensely flawed and desperately needs to go away, I worry about solutions like Privacy Sandbox, because then you can actually inflate the number of users that qualify as in a segment, and there's no sort of way of independently checking or validating that that person ever really exists outside of first-party data on an absolute perfect transaction. Yeah,
other than Google having logged in users and people voluntarily, you know, using their services for free. So Google has, you know, logged in information, firsthand information. But my take on that question, whether it's whether the cookies going away will increase fraud or decrease fraud, is I think it's going to have no impact on fraud. And
interesting.
Let me give you two examples. There's some examples where it would go up and other examples where it would go down. So for example, the type of fraud that I mentioned earlier, the retargeting fraud, where the bots go to certain sites and collect cookies so that they appear to be physicians so that they can earn higher money, that's going to go away, right? So that's lowering of the fraud. But in other cases, people have argued that, oh, if we don't have, you know, those third-party cookies, Shalin was saying yesterday at the IAB there webcast, if we don't have a way to cookie the user that we've already determined to be a bot, it's going to increase the work that a lot of people have to do to calculate it again over and over again. So in those cases, it would actually make it easier for the bots to stay hidden because it increases the burden and the cost on the good guys to detect them. So I think it can go either way. And that's why I don't think the cookie going away is going to actually have any material impact on fraud, because the fraud will just kind of slither into other areas and keep going in new forms.
Mm. Well, just one more. Yeah, go ahead. Just one more example. So we've seen with GDPR, for example, that should also reduce targeting, but we've seen bots that send over consent signals as if they're consenting users.
Exactly.
So they can continue and get retargeted.
Exactly. So I like to say, you know, humans haven't given consent, but bots have. So if you're doing, if you're targeting cookies with consent strings, you might actually be targeting more bots. And the same thing happened a number of years ago with ad blocking. Humans block ads, bots don't, because it's their job to cause the ad to load. So if you're still doing programmatic and you're targeting the users that have not turned on ad blocking, you're more likely to actually be targeting bots instead.
So quickly, before we start, oh, sorry, go ahead, Josh. Go ahead.
Sorry, I know you're meant to be moderating, but you know, we're having a good conversation.
All good, let it go.
I mean, there was a question that came up in the chat panel at some point from the audience, which was about viewability, and is viewability a good proxy for actually policing for fraud? And to Augustine's point, it's absolutely not, because if you want to guarantee fraudulent, you know, views, you'll almost get perfect 100% viewability, because that's the easiest thing to optimize a bot towards. The other one that's come up, and before I hand it back to you as a moderator, that I want to answer, is there was a question that came up about, do, you know, brands care about being next to safe information, or is it about premium publishers? From my perspective, we define brand safety as not being on hate speech, disinformation, or things like that sort of content. It's not more complex than that. Everything else is a reasonable place to be. There was a question somewhere in the chat which was like, hey, if you're next to a sort of a negative news story, negative in air quotes, because that's difficult to define. And in all the research we've done, there is not an example that we've found where a member of the public blames a brand for the news story that's on a page. People are smart enough to separate and understand that a news story is the news story, and the advertisement around it is the advertisement around it.
And I'll connect to that, to just what we like to say is that there's the things that Joshua mentioned, that's the brand safety stuff. Everything else about that's more a matter of suitability rather than safety. And in terms of when you think about the news, we talk to brands and we ask them, are you going to stop and advertise on the evening news? because some stories there may be, less suitable in other settings? And the answer is oftentimes not. And so what we try to encourage brands is to take that broader consideration set into effect and to have the right tools. So you don't want to be on hate speech, but if it's an article discussing the impact on hate speech on society, you don't want to de-target that and defund that just because it has the word hate speech somewhere in there. So it's much more complex than just a keyword problem, and it requires a different approach.
And this gets back, like, there's a fundamental thing right now to, Claire's earlier point about, keyword lists is like, and I did see it also come up in the chat window, like advertising has to absolutely align with your brand values and responsibility. So you can't issue the tweet or the post in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and yet at the same time add those to a keyword list. Like, that is irresponsible from a brand. And what you're doing, and this is where brand safety and fraud intersect, what you're doing is actually incentivizing fraudulent sites not to cover those topics. So more traffic just gets scammed.
So we're getting close to the top of the hour. I want to get to a couple more questions here and then have everybody go through a round of their recommendations and takeaways, for the audience. So just, I think quickly, I'm seeing a bunch of questions around, are there particular channels that are worse than others? Is Safari better? Is it rooted with a publisher or app? Anyone want to take a crack at, what are the riskiest areas right now?
So I can talk from the malvertising side. So we release every quarter what we call our demand quality report, where we analyze the 70+ billion impressions programmatic that we're monitoring these days for publishers, client side.
Yeah. And
then we just released a new one on Q1, and one of the charts that we included was an analysis from a malvertising perspective. What is the operating system in the browser that attracts more attacks than others? How does it break down? And there was a very clear preference for Windows operating systems and both Chrome and Edge browsers. Windows is by leaps and bounds compared to all the other operating systems, the preferred targeting environment for malvertising specifically.
So,
which is funny because my perception is Safari and iOS is a very high performing advertising channel for advertisers.
So
it's two different issues.
iOS was last year for malvertising. Last year, iOS was predominant, and it's switched this year.
Yeah, Brian, that's a good question, because I think a lot of people perceive that. So there's two different issues here. What LD is talking about is the vulnerability of the machine itself to malicious code. So what the bad guys are trying to do is compromise your Windows machine, whereas last year they were trying to compromise iPhones and iOS devices. When it comes to ad fraud, it's different. The bad guys want to pretend to be Chrome browsers because it's the biggest haystack, right? Chrome browsers used by humans represent 66 or 2/3 market share. So it's actually much easier for the bad guys committing ad fraud to pretend to be Chrome versus other ones, right? Because it's easier to hide, or make their bots pretend to be Chrome. So slightly different issues, right? If you're attacking the device, as in malvertising, you're attacking the most vulnerable device, and Windows machines are, versus if you're trying to make your bots appear to be something you want to hide in the largest haystack, which is Chrome.
Got it.
And obviously you point out a good point. Even when we talk about ad fraud, we're using a term that, for me at least, only applies to one of the two vectors, the scams and the exploits and the malvertising. Is that considered, is that fraudulent? Is that the right word for it? It's like if we...
No, in fact, you taught me that. It's, basically we separate that out, right? If it's targeting the user to compromise their device, it's the stuff that you guys deal with. That's malvertising. It's not fraud. And then
but we as an industry continue to lump them together.
Exactly. They're interrelated, but the nuance is that they're entirely different. Just like Brian was asking, the browsers, Safari is targeted more by the marketers because they think they're targeting a higher or more affluent audience set, right? But that's an entirely different issue than when the bad guys are trying to compromise your iOS because they need to refill some of those bots, right? So
there's so many vectors, right, that are competing in terms of what people are going after here.
And,
so in our last 5 minutes, though, I'd like to just quickly let the five of you each take a minute for your takeaways, starting with you, Claire. What do you want our audience to come away with from today's panel?
Sure. normally our audience is marketers, and we always tell marketers, check your ads, check your allow list, check your block list, and just look through them as a human. Just check up on the bots, on the robots, make sure that everything's good. But because this audience is also lots of ad tech, what I would say is Nadine and I, we're always contacting these ad tech platforms about them selling these bad faith publishers. And we're finding these bad faith publishers in our site lists. And we're saying, hey, the Epoch Times is on there. Do you know the Gateway Pundit is on there? The Daily Caller is on there. Why are you selling us things that we so clearly do not want in our inventory? We do not want our ads on there. I would say to the ad tech folks that are in this audience here today, check your ads. Figure it out. We do not want to be on these places. Nobody does. So stop selling them, please.
Roy, how about you next?
Thank you. So I think we talked about a lot of things today. One thing that's worth emphasizing is the needed focus on prevention, not just monitoring, because if you prevent spend on fraudulent inventory, on fake news, on hate speech, you stop the entire funnel of most of it from even happening. You stop monetization, you stop the waste, you support real publishers, because that's where your money will end up going, and you support and you stop the entire issues with measurement of outcomes, with crippling your data pools of what the real user and consumer for your brand is. So by employing prevention, you can kind of like stop all of the negative waterfall that comes from that. And I think it's very important for brands and buyers to take that into account when they think about quality for fraud and everything else.
Joshua, how about you?
Part of me wants to repeat Claire's call to action, which is check your ads for both advertisers and the ad tech ecosystem. The other one that I would call out is hold your partners accountable. So when you find these sorts of things, hold them accountable. Stop doing business with them. You know, you have to send a message.
What if it's Google though, Joshua? What if it's Google? That's, you know, a lot of people.
I still hold them accountable.
Okay.
You can't be afraid to hold people accountable.
Dr. Fou, what do you want people to walk away with here?
You know, my message has been pretty consistent. It's really be more vigilant than you are now. So if you're a marketer and you typically don't look at the data and the analytics yourself because your agency does it for you, look into it, because really, hopefully
ask
you
for those
realize,
log files.
Not necessarily, ask for the placement reports, because the log files most people can't deal with anyway. But bottom line is, there's always more fraud than you think there is, because the bad guys are really good at covering their tracks. So whatever numbers you get in your reports, that's fine. That's a baseline, but just stay vigilant and look for kind of other telltale signs that something's not right. And the most ideal thing marketers can do is actually look at their business outcomes. You'd be surprised at how few actually do that, because, oh, it's too hard, so we just don't do that.
So it comes back to the fundamentals. Make your ads, make your ads good, make your ads work, and go from there. LD, before I wrap it up, what would you say to our folks here?
I will build on what Claire and Joshua said, as well as Augustine and Roy. It's hold yourself accountable. What role do what role do you and your company contribute to these issues, and set the right path and set the right principles and propagate them? Again, either someone's in the camp of malvertiser fraudster and they're the bad guys, or not. And if not, we have a responsibility to each other and to ourselves to make this right, because we can. This is within our control.
Well, with that, let me thank all of the panelists. Guys, I thought this was really great. I really enjoyed everybody's contributions and comments, as well as our viewers. I see a lot of friends and former colleagues and customers in there, and it's really great to see everyone coming together to ask a bunch of interesting questions and try to figure this out, because it is, I think, a really, really difficult and challenging problem that's going to be with us for some time. So look forward to doing this topic again, I think, and chat with you guys all soon. So thanks again. I'm Brian from WorkReduce. Really appreciate everyone joining today. See ya.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.